HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Fallacies of Racism, Understanding How Common Perceptions Uphold White Supremacy, First Edition, by Jennifer Patrice Sims, read by Deanna Anthony. Introduction. In September of 2012, I stood behind a podium in an auditorium-style classroom, shaking as students filed in and took their seats. I was a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and while the course was not my first as the instructor of record, it was the first time I would be teaching 200 mostly white students specifically about race and racism in the United States. What have I gotten myself into? I texted my mother. The start of a new way to teach about race and racism as it would turn out. The semester passed in a whirlwind of typical new class stressors, over-preparing for lectures, learning how to manage a class of 200, supervising 2 teaching assistants who were otherwise my peers, realizing I had brought too many scantrons to the exam. As a young Black woman teaching at a primarily white institution, PWI, I also faced being challenged and insulted by white students when they preferred their own racist stereotypes to the data and data-informed explanations presented in my class. Since that first class over 10 years ago, I have come to recognize this as a situation of many students coming to my classroom with ideas about race and racism that are, put most kindly, problematic. Inaccurate ideas like immigrants don't pay taxes, when sales taxes are the thing in most states, are frustrating. But racist, sexist ideas like Black women should stop having children, especially when stated matter-of-factly to my face in the middle of class, represent one of the hardest parts of teaching. Recognizing that students more than likely entered my classroom ignorant of academic conceptualizations of racism and or believing misinformation from their prior schooling and the media, when I first began teaching race ethnicity, I was extremely focused on presenting academic definitions, showing lots of empirically accurate information, and debunking stereotypes. I used a textbook that defined racism as social domination that arranges life in such a way that its ordinary, everyday workings serve to benefit certain racial groups, predominantly whites, at the expense of others, predominantly non-whites. My lecture slides showed the latest data and numbers on racial trends and disparities from reputable organizations like the U.S. Census, Bureau of Labor Statistics, and Federal Bureau of Investigation. To my mind, these statistics provided facts and disproved stereotypes. I emphasized the normality and logic of an evidence-based approach with a statement in my syllabus that, in no field do professors purposefully teach inaccurate information about their topics. When my first student evaluations arrived, they were split. Some students said I was teaching my opinion and that I marked off when students did not share my opinion. Others accused me of being biased against white men. At the same time, I received comments like, "I loved this class. It was very interesting and eye-opening." In addition, I received official recognition from 3 students via their campus organizations, Honored Instructor or Influential Instructor Award Program. Due to some students getting it from my data-driven approach, I stayed the course. I thought that if I showed and explained the numbers clearly enough, that more students would come away with an empirically accurate picture of race and racism in the U.S. For example, in covering race and the economy, I showed data demonstrating that the numeric majority of U.S. Americans on welfare are white, not Black, welfare queens or Latina illegals. I believed that if I closely stuck to the numbers that students would be unable to dismiss information, even information that contradicted common but racist stereotypes, as merely my opinion or bias. Then, one comment shattered this delusion. One student wrote, "I will never believe a word she says, no matter how many statistics she shoves down my throat." While, of course, no instructor can expect that every student in their class will learn, appreciate, or even believe the topics they teach, seeing that even cold, hard numbers, in a science class no less, could be rejected in favor of racist beliefs was humbling. The comment was an example of the militant and aggressive commitment that many U.S. Americans have to remain ignorant of the empirical reality of racism. Fortunately, the comment also shone a light on a pedagogical way forward, for it made me realize that before I could hope to get some students to even consider a data-informed perspective on race and racism, I had to first actually address the entrenched, cultural-serving distortions with which they entered my classroom. In his now infamous book, Lies My Teacher Told Me, sociologist James Loewen argues that adults have problematic ideas about race and racism in large part because middle and high school history social studies classes teach cultural-serving distortions. That is, for their first education, people are taught lies, such as the myth that Reconstruction failed because Black people mismanaged it as they weren't ready for full citizenship, which supports a white supremacist ideology and material social structure. Though he originally wrote the words while I was in junior high school, by graduate school, I had joined the population of sociology professors who are amazed and depressed at the level of thinking about society displayed each fall, especially by white upper-middle-class students in their first-year classes. Psychologists have found that if prior knowledge is inaccurate and consists of misconceptions, new learning can be particularly difficult and resistant to correction. I realized that it was not enough to present students with data and expect that they would, upon comparison of it with their first education, be able to recognize that social science offers a more rational and systemic view of society than high school history books, clickbait media, or their cousin's boyfriend's hot takes on social media. So, I decided to teach my students to think critically about the common yet distorted ideas about race and racism that so many of them brought to the classroom. In this pursuit, I dedicated first a half and then eventually a whole lesson to what racism is not. Exploring a topic by focusing on what it is not has been found to be a useful way to gain key insights into the properties of a phenomenon. The first chapter of the race textbook I use lists 5 fallacies about racism, and the authors, sociologists Matthew Desmond and Mustafa Amir Bayer, explain that there are many misconceptions about the character of racism. Americans are deeply divided over its legacies and inner workings, and much of this division is a result of the fact that many Americans understand racism in limited or misguided ways. The authors go on to define fallacies as logical mistakes, factual or logical errors in reasoning, that they say are recurrent in many public debates about racism. Likewise, early in sociologist Crystal Fleming's How to Be Less Stupid About Race, she details 6 fallacious ideas about white supremacy that I'd like to address up front, half of which overlap the described by Desmond and Amir Bayer. In both of their books, the concept of fallacies helpfully functions to debunk common but problematic perspectives on racism before readers dive into the deeper content. Desmond and Amir Bayer say it plainly, writing, "Before we articulate what we believe race to be, however, perhaps the best way to start off is by offering some suggestions on how not to think about race." Situated within sociological theories of racial epistemology, the fallacies of racism focuses deeply and wholly, not just passingly for a few introductory sections, on ignorance of racism, that is, what it is not. I build on the concept of fallacies of racism by analyzing a dozen common perceptions that, upon closer examination, are revealed to be rooted in an epistemology of ignorance that functions to uphold white supremacy. Some of the fallacies that will be discussed are expansions of those that Desmond, Amir Bayer, and Fleming briefly mentioned, but the majority are culture-serving perceptions that I have identified from my teaching and research. Coming up, I summarize the theoretical framework within which fallacies are conceptualized, briefly lay out the 12 fallacies that will be discussed in the coming chapters, and offer my own introductory, getting on the same page, caveats. An epistemology of ignorance. Many social theorists have discussed how dominant patterns of thinking in society exist to maintain the legitimacy of society. Karl Marx, for example, famously said that the ruling ideas are the ideas of the ruling class. Antonio Gramsci coined the concept of homogeny to describe ideas that are dominant, dominating, and culture-serving yet unnamed. Pierre Bourdieu wrote of the illusio in society, that is, the ideas that justify the current terms of capital transfer that must be bought into in order for social exchanges to proceed in any given field. With respect to dominant patterns of thinking about race and racism specifically, there is an emergent body of scholarship in sociology that focuses on theorizing the role of ignorance in justifying and reproducing inequality. Charles Wade Mills's theory of the racial contract, in particular his concept of there being an epistemological aspect to it, offered one of the first powerful explanations of how patterns of thinking function to support white supremacy. In brief, the racial contract is the term Mills gives to the typically unacknowledged yet guiding agreement among white people to support the white supremacist status quo. Mills further suggests that we can think of the epistemological aspect of the racial contract as an idealized consensus about cognitive norms and an understanding about what counts as a correct, objective interpretation of the world. When it comes to race and racism, the cognitive norms and what counts as a correct, objective interpretation of the world are actually to misinterpret the world. One has to learn to see the world wrongly, but with the assurance that this set of mistaken perceptions will be validated by white epistemic authority. This is a racism-specific application of the more general philosophical understanding that the powerful have no interest in achieving a proper interpretation of society. They have a positive interest in sustaining the extant misinterpretation, since that is what favors those in power. Mills calls societal-level patterns of thinking that utilize misinterpretation to maintain inequality an epistemology of ignorance. He asserts that misunderstanding, misrepresentation, evasion, and whites' self-deception on matters related to race are in no way accidental but prescribed and are among the most pervasive mental phenomena of the past few hundred years. Historically, these inverted patterns of thinking regarding race and racism were required for conquest, colonization, and enslavement to reconcile calculated economic exploitation with, first, Christian religious doctrines like love thy neighbor, and later secular ones like all men are created equal. However, an epistemology of ignorance was not just necessary in the past during eras of infamous, overt, and large-scale racist projects. It continues to function in the present by undergirding perceptions of contemporary racism. As in the past, thinking about race and racism today requires a certain schedule of structured blindness and opacities in order to establish and maintain the white polity. As such, both historic and contemporary patterns of localized and globalized cognitive dysfunctions are psychologically and socially functional in that they not only justify but reproduce white supremacist material structures. Building on Mills and other critical race theory scholars, such as Joe Fagan, Eduardo Bonilla Silva, and Moon Ki-young, sociologist Jennifer Mueller's theory of racial ignorance, TRI, conceptualizes ignorance as a cognitive accomplishment grounded in explicit and tacit practices of knowing and non-knowing. Mills's epistemology of ignorance is the first tenet of TRI. The second tenet of TRI, that ignorance is an ends-based technology, describes how its function is to provide specific outcomes that members of society, especially members of the dominant group, are motivated to pursue. These include not only the material spoils of white domination, such as greater opportunity to obtain quality goods like housing and services like healthcare, but also psychic outcomes, such as being able to feel one legitimately earned everything. Mueller's third tenet, corporate white agency, describes how, in addition to individuals' ignorance, structural and institutional mechanisms facilitates white ignorance. The U.S. state of Florida offers a clear example. In 2023, the governor signed a bill that banned teaching about systemic racism in public schools. Regardless of whether this ban stands or ultimately crumbles under the weight of legal challenges, organized efforts like it to regulate what information schools can teach on racism demonstrates how institutions can contribute to maintaining widespread ignorance of racism. A focus on the centrality of praxis, TRI's fourth tenet, draws attention to the specific social processes and many practical ways ignorance manifests and can be observed in social life. This includes what people do, i.e., practice, as a reflection of racial logic, and also what people write and say because of it. Understanding actions and thinking means that TRI is able to identify how a wide variety of white racial projects, including the most well-meaning and progressive, actually stem from the culture-serving commitment to ignorance. Theorizing how all of the foregoing phenomena evolve and change is the final tenet of interest convergence. Mueller explains that because white ignorance advances white people's material and psychic interests, large segments of society have little incentive to alter or eradicate it. In sum, Mills's epistemology of ignorance, Mueller's theory of racial ignorance, and the many scholars who lay the foundation for a general sociology of ignorance have established that ignorance is a bona fide, if often vexing, social fact. Considering the dangers of scientific illiteracy and post-factual societies, Mueller asserts that examining the place of ignorance within systems of racism is timely and necessary for anti-racist progress. It undoubtedly has great potential to illuminate how common thinking about racism is marred in a white supremacist logic of distortion that there are material and mental benefits to protecting. However, it would be impractical and ineffective in most undergraduate classrooms, not to mention in casual conversations, to take a deep dive into the scholarship of epistemology. Using a condensed, portable synthesis, such as Fallacies, though, can help bring this understanding from behind paywalls and erudite language and into everyday usage. The Fallacies of Racism. From historic indigenous resistance to the nation's first racist project of European colonization, to the contemporary rejection of white beauty standards that is Black women wearing our natural hair, the idea that white domination is natural and just versus human imposed and immoral has been constantly challenged since its inception. To reassert a Bourdieusian elusio in such a clearly unjust system, though, takes specific cognitive tactics born of white agency motive and creativity. The coming chapters describe examples of practical ways racial ignorance manifests and is observable in social life. I call these fallacies of racism. As will be shown, fallacies are perceptions, but they are not simply thoughts. As patterns of thinking, they are tools that are used in writing and conversations to knowingly or unknowingly maintain white domination by obscuring the operation of it and or attempting to neutralize challenges to its legitimacy. Within Mueller's TRI framework, the fallacies of racism are a part of her tenets of praxis and ends-based technologies. After this introduction, the book presents a dozen common perceptions about racism. Some of these fallacies are expanded treatments of those that Desmond, Amir Bayer, and Fleming briefly mentioned, but the majority are additional perceptions that I have identified from my teaching and research. Throughout these chapters, I not only describe common patterns of thinking regarding racism, but also demonstrate how they are ends-based. In other words, the chapters will demonstrate how perceptions function to maintain white supremacist logics and, by extension, material practices of oppression, even in the absence of active or conscious white supremacist beliefs. The first section of the book presents the first three fallacies of racism. The individualistic fallacy, Chapter 1, is the notion that racism only exists at the individual level. In other words, it is the view that there is nothing systemic nor structural about racism. The token fallacy, Chapter 2, is the idea that racism only exists if all power and resources are held by whites, and conversely, it is the idea that if so much as one member of another race has any power or resources, then racism against that group does not exist. The familiarity fallacy, Chapter 3, is the belief that a person cannot possibly be or act racist against a given group if that person has a relationship with a member of that group. Because these fallacies share the common feature of being individual-focused, taken together they are called the micro-level fallacies. The 5 fallacies that are the focus of Section 2 are called the mezzo-level fallacies. Mezzo, i.e. middle or in-between, level analysis within sociology studies localized norms and processes within groups, organizations, and social institutions. Privileging what a person says over what they do is the Simon Says fallacy, Chapter 4. Named for the childhood game, it is the perception that if Simon says jump, then the group jumps, and if Simon says, I'm not racist, then the group believes that he is not racist. The mens rea fallacy, Chapter 5, is the perspective that premeditated, malicious intent is a prerequisite for racism to exist or have occurred. The innuendo fallacy, Chapter 6, is the view that coded language and behavior do not exist with respect to racism. In other words, it is the perception that only explicitly hateful speech and actions are racist, and that it is invalid to claim that euphemisms or codes can be racist too. The perception that pointing out instances of racism is problematic, or even constitutes an act of racism itself, is the recognition fallacy, Chapter 7, and the perspective that collective action to defend or protect minorities against racist oppression is just as harmful as oppression itself, and thus is wrong, is the self-defense fallacy, Chapter 8. Section 3 examines 4 macro-level fallacies, that is, perceptions that are socio-historically focused, structural, and systemic. The legalistic fallacy, Chapter 9, is the perspective that having a law against racism means racism no longer exists. The fixed fallacy, Chapter 10, is the perspective that racism does not modernize over time, and thus only specific types of historical actions are racist, not anything in the present. The perspective that those past actions did not create, and in fact have nothing to do with, the state of current conditions is the ahistorical fallacy, Chapter 11. Lastly, the silence fallacy, Chapter 12, is the assumption that talking about race at all is harmful and that silence is the best way to solve racism. The conclusion contains a summary of my overarching argument about fallacies of racism. Far from being specific ideas that people actively subscribe to in order to create racist disparities, fallacies are instead unexamined general patterns of thinking that are rooted in an epistemology of ignorance. As such, if they are not interrogated, they will function to justify and reproduce white domination, both ideologically and materially. The conclusion of the book also acknowledges that many, if not all, of the fallacies can apply to gender inequality, sexual orientation inequality, and other systems of oppression as well. While it is outside the scope of one book to cover all manifestations of fallacy-based perceptions about inequality, the conclusion highlights the possibilities. The final section of the conclusion and book contains suggestions for incorporating the lessons in the fallacies of racism into our thinking and action in multiple areas of everyday life. Caveats. There are a couple of important caveats to address before diving into the fallacies of racism. First, this book covers 12 fallacies. However, that is not to say that these are the only fallacies in the past, present, or future. Psychologists use systems justification theory to explain the phenomenon of people using ideas about groups and individuals to justify the way things are, so that existing social arrangements are perceived as legitimate, desirable, and fair. As existing social arrangements shift, so too must patterns of thinking about them, though always in service to maintaining their legitimacy. Thus, specific fallacies of racism will wax and wane, but the existence of white supremacist system justifying patterns of thinking persists. A ready example of this is my non-inclusion of a chapter on the biological essentialism fallacy. When Western elites' religious Christian understanding of society gave way to scientific reason, the pattern of thinking about the origins of groups likewise changed. Dominant Western understanding of human difference shifted from religious frameworks, like Africans carried the curse of Noah's son Ham, to scientific ones, like Native Americans and Africans are subhuman. Notice, though, that within both frameworks, the perception of white superiority vis-a-vis non-white inferiority is maintained. Having now mapped the entire human genome, science is clear that members of all races are equally human and that there are not even subspecies divisions like there are breeds of dogs or types of flowers. Even before the 21st century offered the technology to peer into humans' genetic makeup, though, it took the commitment to an epistemology of ignorance to maintain the perception of race as biological. During the 17th through 19th centuries, for example, the fact that the widespread sexual assault of enslaved black women by white men led to mixed-raced children who were themselves fertile, unlike the mule from which the word mulatto was derived, was proof that members of different races were equally human from a biological perspective. However, in order to justify enslavement, walking, talking, and procreating proof of black and white biological equality was ignored in favor of the culture-serving biological essentialism fallacy that assigned non-whites subhuman status. Racial groups are socially constructed, meaning they have been created by context-specific social events, colonization, war, enslavement, classification laws, etc., that used arbitrary selected characteristics, some biological, some not, to classify people into groups and then use that classification as justification to mistreat them accordingly. Presently, in the 21st century, the dominant pattern of thinking about racial groups is no longer that Western minorities are biologically subhuman. Likewise, while there are certainly those who believe that members of different races have different biological predispositions in some specific areas, for example, there are perceptions that whites and Asians are innately intelligent while blacks are innately athletic, biology is no longer the dominant explanation for group difference. Research on white U.S. Americans' analysis of the origins of racial disparities in housing and wealth, for example, does not find any assertions of biological difference. Because social conditions have changed from the 17th century to now, new, albeit equally distorted, dominant patterns of thinking have arisen. The coming chapters focus on these contemporary fallacies, but, as will be made clear, regardless of which fallacies of racism exist at a particular point in time, they are all ends-based epistemological technologies that function to justify and reproduce white domination. The point, then, as discussed in the conclusion, is not to view the fallacies as a taxonomy to be memorized. The goal is to analyze current fallacies in order to learn how to identify how patterns of thinking can function to maintain inequality. Second, this book is written to make dense theoretical concepts regarding racism and cognitive science accessible and memorable. However, unlike other books on the topic of racism and cognition, The Fallacies of Racism is not mainly writing to a white audience. To be sure, Numerous scholars have given ink to the observation that it is most frequently white people who, when confronted with empirically accurate information about racism, respond with emotional fragility and the cognitive gymnastics that characterize.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?